and he's going to talk about sentience and the precautionary principle. Thank you, Jonathan. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Penny. Thanks for organising this event. Of course, it was originally organised for 2020, so I really appreciate the tenacity you've shown in making this event happen. I'm going to talk about sentience and the precautionary principle. I'm the principal investigator on the Foundations of Animal Sentience project, which is a 5-year Horizon 2020 project that aims to understand better how we can study sentience scientifically and how we can put the science of animal sentience to work to design better policies, laws, and ways of caring for animals. Now, this time slot is quite short, and so the talk will go quite quickly, I think. But if you want to look at any of the slides, if you go to bit.ly/birchseb, that link that is on the bottom corner of the slide there, you can find the slides to look at in your own time. And also, if it's easier for you, there's a QR code on the slide that will take you to the same place. So Helen talked already about definitions of sentience. I think of sentience as the capacity to have feelings with a positive or negative quality, such as feelings of pain, pleasure, comfort, discomfort, boredom, excitement, contentment, frustration, anxiety, joy. It's really the list of examples, I think, that does the work there, and the longer the better as far as I'm concerned, because it's through that list of examples that we can reflect on our own feelings and extract that more general idea of something they all have in common. They're all feelings. They all feel bad or feel good. They all have a positive or negative quality. And when we're debating animal sentience, that is often what we're looking for. It's not just pain and pleasure, as Helen already emphasized. It's also about having feelings, not anything more complicated than that. It's not, in its most basic form, about being able to reflect on your feelings or think about them. It's not about being able to understand the feelings of others. These are more sophisticated capacities that go beyond what is necessary for sentience. And importantly, a sentient animal doesn't need to have any of the specific feelings that we have to count as sentient. Those examples are to get us to this more general idea of sentience. But it doesn't have to be that other animals feel pain like we do or pleasure like we do. They may well be having feelings that are still very much feelings to them. They feel like something, but are not feelings that we have any words for. I think the urge to define feeling in terms of species-specific mechanisms needs to be resisted. There's often a temptation to do that, to say, well, we understand quite a lot about the mechanisms of pain in mammals, for example, so let's now redefine sentience in terms of those mechanisms. But we shouldn't do that, because we need to be open to the possibility that feelings can be realized in lots of different ways. There can be ways to the same outcome that are very different to the ways we find in mammals. The fact that the brain of an octopus, for example, is organized in a completely different way from the brain of a mammal doesn't mean they can't have feelings, any more than the fact that the eye of an octopus is organized very differently from the eye of a mammal means that they can't see. So why does sentience matter? Helen mentioned Jeremy Bentham's dictum. The question is not can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? I think a more blunt way of putting that is that there's nothing wrong with boiling a vegetable, but there is something wrong with boiling a sentient being, at least without an extremely good reason. If you're sentient, you have interests. You have interests in avoiding certain kinds of experiences and interests in having other positive kinds of experience. And those interests deserve consideration. And this is widely recognized in laws around the world. And in particular, sentience is taken to be the crucial criterion for inclusion in animal welfare law in the UK, the EU, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And in between those ethical and legal roles of sentience, I think sentience also matters when you're thinking about policies and regulations that maybe aren't written into law, but are at a smaller, more local scale. For example, if you run a lab and you're thinking about what should the policies be of this lab, should we treat these animals as if they were sentient beings, or should we treat them as if they weren't sentient? Sentience really matters in that context as well. So this all leads us to the question of which animals are sentient. The concept matters so much. So which animals does it apply to? Which animals other than humans? And we run into what I call the problem of animal sentience, which is that if we ask what the best quality evidence would be for sentience in another being, if we ask what in humans, if you have a patient in a ward who appears to be in a coma and you're wondering whether they've come out of the coma or not, what are you going to do? You're going to try and ask them. You're going to try and get verbal reports of their experiences. And in fact, the science of human consciousness still depends on verbal reports. It relies on disentangling subjective experience from all of the unconscious stuff going on in the brain by asking people whether they're experiencing a stimulus or not. In non-human animals, we don't have that. We can't ask animals for verbal reports. In other mammals, we can at least point to substantial similarity of neural mechanisms, but I've already emphasized that that isn't the case for something like an octopus. We can't just look at the brains of fish and invertebrates and look whether all the same mechanisms are there. The result of this is severe uncertainty and persistent controversy. You still even now get critics of the idea of sentience in fish. Brian Key, for example, in this paper from 2016, that then provoked more than 40 critical commentaries. Key's argument was basically fish don't possess the mechanisms that are involved in producing pain experience in mammals. They don't have a neocortex, that crinkly outer layer of the brain that is linked to many sophisticated functions, including subjective experiences of pain in mammals. So we should conclude that they're not sentient. And many of these 40 critics replied that that's simply too quick. The fact that fish don't have the same brain mechanisms we do does not mean they haven't found other ways to realize similar subjective experiences, including perhaps experiences of pain. The fish are just one of a family of hard cases where if sentience is there, it must be achieved by substantially different neural mechanisms to the way it's achieved in us. You can think here about cephalopod mollusks. Talks a lot about octopuses, but think too about cuttlefish, squid, nautiloids, like the bottom left picture there. Or think about decapod crustaceans, like the hermit crab in the picture, or insects like honeybees. Perhaps, like I think Helen is, you're convinced already that all of those animals are sentient. Even then, there will still be other hard cases. You then might be pushed to thinking about different species, like horseshoe crabs, for example, that are extremely important research animals in vaccine production. Are they sentient or not? About nematodes, again, a hugely important model organism in science. Are they sentient or not? I think scientists working with these animals have tended to assume that they're probably not, but is that right or not? What about other animals like jellyfish? Where should one draw the line? One way or another, it seems like we run into this incredibly difficult line drawing exercise. Why are these cases hard? Well, there's no scientific consensus on the nature of sentience, how to test for it, which animals have it, which don't. And it's very easy to generate reasonable doubt about these cases. If we think about a nematode or a horseshoe crab, we can imagine that animal having feelings, certainly, but we can also very clearly imagine the possibility that it doesn't have feelings. And it's very easy to generate reasonable doubt. And then it raises that looming concern that what if very valuable science, like the development of vaccines, ends up being disrupted because we assume these animals were sentient when in fact they were not? And there's no agreement on how to settle those controversies for legislative or any other purposes. And in some cases, you also get concerns about the costs of getting it wrong and the potential for economic or scientific consequences of what you might call over-regulating. How then should we handle this very difficult predicament? Well, in my work on this, I've suggested that a useful idea in this context is the precautionary principle. Precautionary principle is a very important principle in environmental policy. It's been around for a long time, and the basic idea is that in the face of scientific uncertainty, it's very important for practical purposes to err on the side of caution. Originally, the adoption of the precautionary principle was driven by cases like CFCs and things like that, where, having realized that CFCs were damaging the ozone layer and decided to regulate them, people then thought, we really shouldn't let that happen again. We really shouldn't wait for evidence to become completely conclusive before we take precautions against risks of terrible damage to the environment. And that thought about damage to the environment, I think, carries over very naturally to the case of animal welfare. Again, there's a strong case for erring on the side of caution, for, in some sense, giving animals the benefit of the doubt. One could formulate that thought in lots of different ways. The slogan I suggested in my paper on this was that where there are threats of serious negative animal welfare outcomes, a lack of scientific consensus as to the sentience of the animals in question shall not be used as a reason for postponing proportionate measures to prevent those outcomes. And certainly since writing that paper, I've come to think that term proportionate measures and the proportionality of the measures is one of the crucial issues. What does it mean in practice then to apply that? It sounds like an attractive slogan, but it could be applied in all kinds of different ways. What does it really mean in practice? Well, here are what I suggest as being sort of 4 rules of thumb, 4 guidelines, I suppose, for thinking in a precautionary way about animal sentience. I think that in policy-making contexts at all levels, and I don't just mean policymakers in Parliament in the UK, although they are thinking about these issues. I mean also the policies you might set for your own labs. We should take a precautionary attitude towards the evidence that exists. What does that precautionary attitude mean? Well, first of all, I think we need to be willing to regard an animal as sentient for the purpose of protecting its welfare on the basis of evidence that is substantial but not conclusive, evidence that does not put the question of sentience beyond reasonable doubt. There can still be reasonable doubt about some of these cases, but if there's substantial evidence, we should start to err on the side of caution and take precautions. Secondly, I think we need to take any behavioral, cognitive, or neural evidence of a valenced experience, an experience with an attractive or aversive quality, as potentially relevant evidence. In other words, we need to cast a broad net in where we get our evidence from, without getting sidetracked by the issue of whether the experience feels like pleasure does for us or feels like pain does for us. You'd always be left wondering. I mean, no matter how much evidence you might have, for example, for sentience in octopuses, you'll still wonder, what does it feel like from the point of view of the octopus? Does an injury to an octopus feel the way an injury does for us? To some extent, we'll always be wondering about those questions, but we shouldn't be sidetracked by those questions when thinking about how to treat these animals and whether to take precautions to protect their welfare. The third idea is that we need to be willing to generalize. We need to be willing to regard all the animals of some appropriate higher taxon, such as the cephalopod mollusks, as being sentient on the basis of evidence from a small number of species. We have to be willing to generalize, because otherwise the alternative is to demand evidence from every single species. And this would be like saying, well, let's not regulate against all CFCs. Let's just regulate against one very specific type and then wait for separate evidence about this other kind of CFC. That's not erring on the side of caution. Erring on the side of caution is being willing to generalize, even if the original evidence that warns you of the welfare risk is coming from a relatively small number of sources. So be willing to generalize, draw evidence from a wide range of sources. Don't expect the evidence to be conclusive. But a fourth principle is that despite all that, I think it's crucial that we don't compromise on normal scientific standards. The evidence we're drawing on must still be high quality, obtained through rigorous experiments that meet good methodological standards. And that's because allowing low quality evidence, it's something that is easily manufactured by both sides in any debate. If we start admitting anecdotal evidence into these debates, in my opinion, it too easily cuts both ways. It's too easy for people who doubt the sentience of various creatures to come up with anecdotes about how, they pulled the legs off and the animal didn't react, etc. The evidence must meet normal scientific standards. So moving on to what counts as evidence, here you may well want to consult the slides at the link at the bottom corner of the page, because this will probably go too quick to memorize unless you have a photographic memory. But with my team on the Foundations of Animal Sentience project, we've been developing what we think are good up-to-date criteria for what sorts of evidence should be enough to trigger a proportionate precautionary response. And we've identified 8 lines of evidence that seem particularly relevant. Now, these are quite focused on the negative side of sentience. They are quite focused on pain-like experiences. But I think that is reasonable in this context, because remember, we're thinking about what calls for precautions. And it is experiences like pain that generate the most severe welfare risks, and where we should be the most precautionary. So we think evidence of nociceptors is relevant, that is, receptors for detecting noxious stimuli, like high acidity breaks to the skin or high temperature. No one would say that nociceptors alone are conclusive evidence of sentience. Of course they're not, because they're in the peripheral nervous system, but they are part of a wider case. They're part of a wider case because in our own case, we know that nociceptors are the beginning of the pain pathway. But also we need to look for evidence of integrative brain regions, where information from different sensory sources is brought together. Another source of evidence can be evidence of pathways that connect nociceptors to the integrative brain regions. The fourth type of evidence can be evidence that the animal's responses to stimuli are altered by potential local anesthetics or analgesics, painkillers, in ways consistent with the hypothesis that these substances attenuate pain. Now, these first 4 types of evidence are largely neurological, but behavioral evidence, as I emphasized, is extremely important too. And here are 4 very important types of cognitive and behavioral evidence. There's evidence of so-called motivational trade-offs, in which the animal weighs the disvalue of a noxious or threatening stimulus against the value of an opportunity for reward, leading to flexible decision-making. For example, there's some evidence that rats will trade off the sweetness of a reward they can access against the coldness of a tunnel they have to crawl through to get the reward. They'll withstand colder temperatures for sweeter rewards. And that's strong evidence of centralized integrative processing of the types of stimuli that is evaluative. Some of those things are evaluated as bad and some as good. The 6th type of evidence is evidence of flexible, directed, self-protective behavior in response to injury and threat. When we find animals that are wound tending, guarding, grooming, rubbing in ways that are directed very precisely to the site of the wound, that's evidence of sentience. The 7th is evidence of associative learning, in which noxious stimuli become associated with neutral stimuli, or novel ways of avoiding noxious stimuli are learned. There's ongoing debate about which types of associative learning are good evidence of sentience and why. There's a massive book by Eva Jablonka and Simona Ginsberg, The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul. There's basically 600 pages all about this question of which types of associative learning are the strongest evidence of sentience. But remember, we're thinking here about how to take a precautionary attitude to the evidence. And in the presence of that ongoing debate, I think it's appropriate to see any associative learning as potentially part of the case for sentience. And the 8th type of evidence is evidence that the animal values potential local anesthetics or analgesics when it's injured. For example, the animal might learn to prefer, when injured, a location at which analgesics or anesthetics can be accessed. So 8 different types of evidence that potentially matter. And let's turn back now to our hard cases and think about where the evidence currently is. Again, you might find the link to the slides or the QR code helpful, because I'm not going to even attempt to review all the evidence for sentience in cephalopod mollusks here. The main message is that there's really a lot. If you think of those 8 types of evidence I just described, to some extent, there's evidence of all of those types. the pathways connecting the nociceptors to the integrative regions are perhaps the least well understood, but the evidence of a lot of connectivity within the cephalopod brain, I think, is very strong. So you've really got a very strong case indeed for sentience in cephalopod mollusks. To give one suggestive example of the sort of literature that leads to that view, I was particularly impressed by this recent paper by Robin Crook from this year that looked at conditioned place preference in octopuses, where Crook's question was, if you give an octopus a choice of 3 different chambers, one of them, it has a bad experience. It has acetic acid injected. And another one, it's able to access a local anesthetic to, that potentially dampens that experience. Will it develop a lasting preference for the place where it could access the anesthetic and a lasting aversion to the place where it was injured? And they do. Crook's octopuses did. And that lined up with these neurological readings along the bottom there of activity in the nervous system that was then dampened by the local anesthetic. So this sort of thing, of course, it's not completely conclusive. You could still imagine an octopus displaying that behavior and not being sentient, but it's really starting to point very strongly in the direction of precautions being extremely appropriate. What then would be proportionate to this evidence? Well, I think it's entirely appropriate that cephalopods are already protected in science in the UK and EU, and I think all countries should take note of that and follow suit. A lot of the evidence, admittedly, is from octopods. Other cephalopods like cuttlefish and squid are less studied, but that's not a good reason to exclude them. Remember, we're taking a precautionary attitude. The fact that they're less studied doesn't mean they don't merit protection. And they should also be protected outside science. It's not enough to just protect them inside science. For example, cephalopods need protection from ill-conceived attempts to farm them. They're extremely inappropriate farm animals, and high welfare cephalopod farming is impossible, as far as I know. Case 2, very quickly, decapod crustaceans. The evidence is not as overwhelming as for cephalopod mollusks. Nonetheless, you go through this list of 8 different types of evidence, and you see it coming up for many, many of those types of evidence. What's proportionate for decapod crustaceans, then? Seems entirely appropriate for me, given this sort of evidence, to extend the existing framework that already protects cephalopods to also protect decapod crustaceans like crabs, lobsters, and crayfish in science. That was first recommended by an expert panel for the EU in 2005, I think, but it was never enacted. And the evidence has just continued to build up since in a way that has generally pointed in the direction of sentience, not against. Again, you can make this point about generalization, that a lot of the evidence is admittedly from the true crabs, the Brachyura and the hermit crabs, Anomura. Other infraorders of decapod are much less studied. Some infraorders of shrimps are extremely poorly understood. But that's not a good reason to exclude them. Remember, we're trying to take a precautionary attitude. We shouldn't exclude them just because they haven't been studied. And decapods also need protection outside science, just like cephalopods. In fact, you could argue the case for protection outside science is even stronger for the decapods because they're extremely widely fished and eaten and subject to extreme slaughter methods like live boiling that can take 2.5 minutes, according to studies, to kill the animal. It would be a perfectly sensible precaution to regulate against that sort of protracted extreme slaughter method. So that's a way of thinking about sentience in a precautionary way, and 2 cases where we should really be acting now, I think, to take stronger protections to protect these animals than we do. If you want to review any of those slides again, the QR code and the link is still there, and I'll post those in the chat as well. In the meantime, thanks very much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. So we've got a break next until 1:15, whatever the hour is, wherever you are in the world. Has anybody got a quick question, perhaps before we break? Anybody got a real burning question? If so, stick it in
Yes,
the chat
it's
box. Or,
Jennifer. I have a question for Jonathan. Is it a yes, no sentience, not sentience, or do you think there are gradations of sentience?
Well, yes, I think there are gradations. My paper, as you know, my paper on dimensions of animal consciousness starts to develop a theoretical framework for trying to think about those gradations. But I also think in the context of regulation and law and policy, those contexts often force this binary choice on us. This choice include in some way or don't include at all. And so I think what this is really about, the evidence I was describing in that talk, what it's really about is making the case for these animals to be included at all. And I think in some ways that is a yes-no question, even though once an animal has been included and treatment of it is regulated, there's then a host of fascinating further questions about what form its sentience takes and how to understand gradual variation along many different dimensions across the animal kingdom.
great, thank you very much.